The earth was broken. Where once had been green fields and rivers, there were now massive, gaping canyons rimmed by towering volcanoes, spurting hot lava down their jagged slopes. Ash clouds and dust storms rolled across former farmland, tainted by radiation from the many nuclear weapons that had rained down on the world in droves during the seemingly endless conflicts that had ravaged the earth in recent times. A one-world government that had initially brought in an era of peace and prosperity had soon turned on the people that had hailed it as their salvation, revealing the true nature of its demonic leaders. Much of the fresh water on the face of the planet had dried up in the heat of the many cataclysms that had rocked the world, including the impact of a great asteroid the global press had ironically named Wormwood, thinking they were clever to be using a fashionably biblical reference, when they were in fact rendering themselves pawns of prophecy. The earth was ruined and barely habitable, far from the paradise it had originally been at the time of its creation. A number of calamitous historical events had led to the earth being in its current state of chaos, beginning not on the planet itself, but in the spiritual realm millennia earlier. It started with the fall of a great many heavenly beings, or Elohim as they are called, from God's kingdom. The main point of contention had been the planned creation of mankind and the great heights that God intended to raise them to in his kingdom. It had been deemed offensive to the heavenly host by some radical elements of the congregation. The first and most outspoken rebel from heaven had been the son of the morning, one of the cherubim, and of the most exalted of Yahweh's servants. Being a charismatic and cunning individual, he had talked many of the Malachim, or angels as they have come to be known, over to his course by convincing them that his ideals were righteous. These unfortunate Malachim then later became the Shadim, or fallen angels, when the arrogant cherub's rebellion inevitably failed and he was driven out of heaven with his followers by the archangel Michael and those of the hosts that had remained loyal. Amongst the next to fall had been a group of Grigori, or watchers, led by one called Shemjaza. Like the cherubim, Grigori were highly ranked and powerful Elohim, and their betrayal came as a great blow indeed to those remaining loyal. Having turned their backs on God, some rebels set about trying to influence the new human creation in a way contrary to the ways of their Creator. If Yahweh was going to insist on creating these creatures, then the fallen Elohim were going to twist them into a parody of God's original intention. Grigori, who had been originally intended to act as overseers over men and guide and protect them, began to fancy themselves as gods and encourage men to worship them instead of Yahweh. They taught them metallurgy for the purposes of warfare, chemistry, mass farming techniques, and perverted sexual practices, amongst other forbidden forms of knowledge. They also performed sexual acts on mankind, which resulted in offspring that God deemed to be abominations. Chief among these were the Nephilim, giant human Elohim hybrids with dark souls who were cruel and treated their smaller cousins like cattle. When a Nephil died, its spirit would not be drawn to the afterlife like a human soul would be, and they would instead wander the spiritual realm as what are oft called demons, desperately seeking out other bodies to inhabit as their only remaining means of interaction with the physical world. The fallen Elohim twisted other aspects of creation as well, using their advanced knowledge to perform genetic experiments and breeding programs on animals to produce fierce creatures with vicious dispositions and voracious appetites for flesh. Elegant horns, originally intended for decoration, became deadly weapons, and teeth made sharp for piercing the outer surface of fruit became fangs for rending flesh or inserting venom. The blood of God's good and gentle creations ran like rivers through the tainted earth. His intended children, created to live in peace and happiness, were instead being sacrificed at brazen altars before they had a chance to live. All this in worship of demented beings who had lost sight of their original glorious purpose, and instead set their hearts after lust for flesh, wealth, and power. Yahweh grew weary of the multiple affronts born out of the interactions between fallen Elohim and godless man, and decided to end the first phase of this behavior with a worldwide flood. During this dreadful period, many of the rebel Elohim chose to leave Earth and seek refuge in the stars, either under their own power or in starships which utilized advanced heavenly technology. Mars had been colonized by the rebels centuries before the flood, but now they explored much farther afield. With no hospitable planets like Earth elsewhere in the galaxy, it was a hard life for any mortal followers they took with them. But with the help of their master's tech and knowledge, they managed to eke out an existence for themselves. Eventually, through a system of breeding programs, genetic experiments, and raids on Earth for breeding stock, fallen empires spreading over numerous star systems blossomed outside of the Sol system, all of them living in artificial environments, as naturally hospitable ones could not be found. Other incursions of rebel Elohim took place back on Earth over the course of the next few centuries, and mankind continued to endure chaos, despite the erasure of the previous advanced fallen civilization in the flood. God offered a permanent solution through the sacrifice of his own Son, Jesus Christ, but not all men chose to accept this wondrous gift. Thus it was that God gave the world over to the fallen for a period of 2 millennia, which were destined to end in a time called the Tribulation, a period lasting 7 years, during which the fallen ruled with an iron fist, and God allowed the planet to be afflicted with natural disasters of every sort. And so it is that the earth has become a corrupted ruin, and rather than blaming their twisted fallen rulers as the culprits, mankind ironically blames their betrayed creator. The 7-year tribulation is now drawing to a close, and has reached its climax at the Battle of Armageddon, the battle to end all battles. The Jezreel Valley had known only drought for several years, and not a thing could grow there in the last days of the earth. But now its parched soil was being fed again, not with water however, but with blood. The Malachim Royal Marines fought their way through the mass of humanity and fallen Elohim that the twisted leaders of Earth were throwing at them. Unfortunately for the forces of evil, the elite soldiers of Christ's Royal Navy were nigh unstoppable. Malachim were on average 8 foot tall and highly skilled warriors, clad in technologically superior armour that, through the erection of directed energy shields, could stop most small to medium caliber weaponry, especially when the prayers of countless saints were behind them. The Church of God was at the battle too, clad in white robes covered in silver plate, and they fought primarily on their knees, keeping the Malachim warriors charged with the power of the Holy Spirit through their prayers. The battle had lasted for hours, and it was only through the power of prayer that losses on the side of heaven had been minimal. The same could not be said for the forces of the fallen. The dead lay everywhere, humans mostly, who had had their heads filled with the lies of the deceiver, and fervently believed that their course had been the just one. They had been tricked into believing they were fighting off a hostile alien invasion force. It had not been Satan's only deception in the last days, but it had probably been his most effective. Through a steady diet of alien invasion movies and false scientific reports, seeds of the deception had been spread by the media for years. Whilst humans formed the majority of the dead, there were other bodies laid amongst them as well. Jadim were the most numerous of the non-human dead, fallen Malachim who had left their heavenly place to serve the fallen gods of earth following promises of power and freedom from God's rule. There were also the giant bodies of Nephilim amongst the dead, monstrous offspring of the forbidden mingling of human and Elohim seed. They had been reintroduced to the earth during the tribulation under the auspices of being a friendly alien race willing to join in the earth's defense. Foolishly, humans accepted them gratefully into society, despite mounting evidence that they were vicious, cannibalistic, lustful, soulless beasts. Numerous organizations were set up defending the rights of Nephilim and insisting that their culture should be tolerated and that dissenters were engaging in discrimination. Drones were amongst the dead as well, small grey creatures that had been a fallen attempt to create an alternate human race, but one that had produced a frail, mindless creature that was only fit for possession by demonic beings, desperate for a way back into the physical realm. Finally, there were corpses of Grigori, or Watchers, those who had been assigned roles of protector over human civilizations, intended to guide them in the ways of the Lord, but had instead fallen into the temptations of power, greed, and lust, and had dragged humanity in the opposite direction. Now the ones who hadn't had the foresight to flee the planet with their followers before Armageddon were lying dead on the dusty plain of Jezreel. The Malachim warrior, Eretel, had been separated from his squad and was trying to link back in with them, but grinding its way towards him was a main battle tank of one of the human armies gathered against them. It fired its gun, but it had aimed directly at him instead of at the ground, which might have been more effective if it had been firing a high explosive round. As it was, the discarding sabot shell narrowly missed him, leaving him entirely unscathed. The Malak unclipped a pulse grenade from his belt and, activating its highest setting, tossed it under the approaching vehicle. As he did, however, a large dark-skinned creature appeared on top of the tank and, shouting a challenge, jumped down to spar with him. "You are fighting on the wrong side, brother. Join us in the fight for freedom instead," the fallen angel hissed. Its voice, physical form, and very mind had been twisted by millennia of living under deception, sown originally by the father of lies. The pulse grenade exploded, neutralizing the tank and momentarily stunning the Shade-In. "You poor fool," Eretel chastised it harshly. With a sidekick, he sent the black-skinned creature sprawling in the dust and strode over to it, his sword raised. He held the platinum-coloured alloy blade, the power of the spirit swirling around it like a thick fog, against the creature's throat. "Surrender, and you may find mercy." The Shade-In spat at him and attempted to bring its sword to bear, but one thrust from Eretel sent the blade on a course right through the fallen Elohim's neck and out of the other side, covered in the evil creature's dark-coloured viscera. With its physical form terminated, the Shade-In spirit would now be confined to the spiritual realm until it had enough strength to reconstitute itself, or until it could be banished to the abyss. It was unlikely to be allowed to escape, however. Eretel knew that hundreds of loyal Grigori were waiting in the spiritual realm for slain fallen, and would instantly banish any who appeared. He was about to resume his search for his squad, when suddenly he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head, and everything went black. As his eyes slowly reopened, blackness became a grey misty montage of blobs, which eventually coalesced into recognisable objects as the world regained colour and slowly began to come back into focus. Eretel staggered to his feet and looked about him, having little idea of how long he had been unconscious. Something had clearly stunned him from behind and knocked him off his feet, but whatever it had been, it no longer seemed to be a threat. A headless Nephil giant lay dead against a burning tank, and he reckoned it was a prime candidate for having been his assailant, though how it had met its end he could only guess. A group of the saints, dressed in their white battle tunics, were stood nearby, barely visible through the thick swirling smoke that seemed to be everywhere, and he wondered if they had contributed towards his rescue. Their eyes were focused on something else in the distance though, and he decided it had probably been one of his Malak brothers who had saved him. What was he doing before he had been struck? His mind was muddled, and it was taking him forever to recollect what had occurred. The elusive memory came to him at last, like a pigeon coming home to roost. He had been trying to find his squad, and had been ambushed by this tank, Shade-In. Then what? "He lives! Get up here before you miss it!" a booming voice shouted in exultation from above, interrupting his thought process. Eretel looked up to see the Archangel Uriel peering down on him from atop the ruined war machine. So here was his rescuer, which came as no surprise whatsoever, as Uriel was legendary in heaven for his martial skills. The powerful Malak was dressed in his usual battered armour that he had favoured since at least the medieval age, His characteristic weapons of 2 spirit axes were hung on his belt. No surer indication could there have been that the battle was over. The weary Eretel clambered up onto the disabled tank next to his commanding officer and looked out over the battlefield. The plain of Megiddo was littered with smoking military equipment and the dead. All manner of fallen beings had thrown themselves at the Lord's army this day, and all had been vanquished. From the looks of things, without much loss on the Lord's side either. There was not a single saint amongst the bodies that he could see. "You're looking the wrong way, old friend," Uriel prompted Eretel, poking him in the side as he did. "I'm sorry, I'm still a little dazed," the Malak replied. "No wonder. That Nephil knocked you on the noggin so hard I thought for sure you'd need a good long sabbatical." Uriel referred to the fact that when Malachim bodies were critically injured, they became confined to the spiritual realm until they could recover enough strength to manifest physically again. Eretel had been lucky this time. The strike had probably been a glancing one. Nephilim weren't generally known for giving love taps in battle. A loud piercing cry of mixed agony and sorrow was what finally drew Eretel's attention away from his contemplation of his near demise. Following Uriel's pointing finger, he looked across the battlefield to the large Megiddo Tell at one end of the valley, where an ancient Canaanite settlement had once stood. A large oval hole had been torn in space above the Tell, revealing only a deep, enduring blackness beyond, darker than any night Eretel had ever seen. In front of the hole, on top of a crashed military cargo plane, stood Michael, the general of the Lord's armies. He was clad in a highly advanced mechanical armoured battlesuit, which increased his normal 9-foot physical size to a little over 12 foot. His helmet was retracted, revealing his chiselled ageless face and his long dark flowing hair. One of the suit's metal robot-like fists was clamped around the neck of a battle-starred cherub, which was bleeding black blood that ran from a wound on its face and down the arm of Michael's suit, where it dripped from his elbow onto the plane. The creature's normally elegant 6 wings were ragged and drooped pathetically from its back like flags in surrender. One of its arms was bent at an unnatural angle, indicating a severe breakage, and the limb flopped about as if the cherub was trying to bring it up, but couldn't. There was a brief flicker and a glimpse of a hideous scaled face, as the cherub tried vainly to transform into the dragon aspect it had favoured at the beginning of the battle, but it now lacked the will, the strength, or possibly both to do so, and the flickering faded as quickly as it had appeared. The 2 combatants were not the most impressive sight on the battlefield though. Behind Michael, on the plane's fuselage overseeing the event, was the most powerful being that had ever existed. He stood at only 7 foot tall and looked entirely humanoid, but appeared to glow as if imbued with all the power of the universe, which was indeed the case. In one hand he held a sword with a blade burning so bright with fire that it hurt the eye to look directly at it. Eretel gazed with admiration and adoration at the one the loyal Elohim called the Beloved, the Creator of all things, the Lord of hosts, the manifestation of God in human flesh, Christ Jesus. "I will be back in 1,000 years, stronger than ever." Eretel's eyes were drawn reluctantly back to the injured cherub as he weakly challenged Michael, his crackling voice lacking the power to render the words any real impact. Michael didn't acknowledge the fallen cherub's taunt, but moved closer to the end of the plane and dropped his defeated foe in a crumpled heap onto the dented fuselage. The portal had been created around the crashed aircraft, and so they had crossed its threshold and were now framed against the darkness inside, only visible due to the intense light emanating from the Lord. "I grant you the boon of entering Tartarus under your own strength. It is less humiliating than being tossed in," the Archangel General offered his longtime nemesis. The cherub stared at him, hatred etched deeply onto its face, like it had been carved there with a chisel. "Perhaps I shall make you throw me." Jesus had witnessed enough. "Go," he instructed the devil. The word hit the fallen Elohim like a powerful physical blow, and he reeled from it. It wasn't possible to refuse a direct order from God, rebel or no. Satan appeared to resign himself to his fate, albeit with obvious reluctance. He stood as erect as he could, faced the crowd that had gathered, and attempted to throw his arms out to his sides, intending a mockery of the sacrifice on the cross. His left arm hung limply at his side though, and the vain effort did not have the desired effect. He dramatically allowed himself to topple backwards into the blackness, and then suddenly he was gone. Michael walked dispassionately back down the crashed aircraft hull, showing no outward sign of satisfaction at having just defeated Earth's greatest foe. The portal to Tartarus closed after him, leaving its banished inhabitants cut off from the outside once more. A white dragon soared past in front of Eretel and Uriel on their tank, and then wheeled around to come at them. As it came near, it appeared to dissolve, and by the time it had landed on the tank next to Uriel, had transformed into its true form, a loyal Grigori. "Well met, Judicus," Uriel greeted the tall, elegant Elohim with finely scaled skin. "Well met, Uriel, and greetings, Commander," he intoned, nodding at Eretel, who returned the gesture. "I wanted to make sure I have an unobstructed view of what is coming next. I hope you do not mind if I share your broken military vehicle," he explained. "You'd have seen more from up there," Eretel pointed towards the sky. Judicus smiled wanly. "Not through this smoke, and I have little strength remaining to stay aloft. For some reason, as soon as the last fallen enemy dropped, so did our prayer cover. I think the attention of the saints is elsewhere, as should ours be," Uriel reflected, turning his eyes back to the Lord. On top of the crashed aircraft, Jesus was looking about him at the devastated earth, and was clearly deeply troubled by what he saw. Michael joined him, and they walked down the fuselage of the plane, coming to stand at the bottom, Jesus seemingly deep in thought. His armour was covered in blood, and two of the nearby saints rushed forward, intending to clean it off, but he raised his hand to stop them. This was not the Lamb of God standing on the plain of Megiddo in the midst of the dead. This was the Lion of Judah. There would be no washing of feet, touching of hems, or welcoming of little children on the battlefield of Armageddon. The Lord of Hosts reached a hand into the air and grabbed at the dust flying about, running some of the captured motes through his fingers as if to sample their texture. Then, as all the beings, men and Elohim alike, gathered on the plain watched, he began to grow. From 7 foot tall, he soon reached 20 foot and then more. As he grew yet larger, more of those gathered on the battlefield could see him with their bare eyes. It occurred to Eretel that this was most likely his intention. People began to fall upon their knees before the Lord, and Eretel did likewise in the same moment that Uriel did. The Lord stopped growing when he reached what the Malak reckoned to be about 100 foot tall, towering over everything around him. At his feet, Elohim and humans alike were shuffling around to avoid being stepped on, though Eretel knew his God well enough to know that there would never be any danger of this. By this point, every redeemed eye could see their Lord in his moment of triumph. Jesus looked about him, his features softening and his face shining, suddenly seeming transformed from Jehovah Nissi, God is my banner, to Jehovah Rapha, the God who heals. He reached his arms out, his palms upward, and spoke one simple word: New. He had not shouted, but it hit the ears of all those around like a bomb going off, and the word brought forth a wind that pushed the dust and radiation along in front of it like seaweed on an ocean breaker. A loud cracking sound came from deep underneath the feet of those gathered, and the earth shook, causing some of the wearier combatants to fall to their knees. Around the Lord's feet shoots began to break forth from the dry ground, and spread outwards like ripples on a pond. The dust that had been in the atmosphere dissipated, and was replaced with puffy white clouds of the kind that men hadn't seen in years, and a soft, gentle rain began to fall. The much cratered and scarred plain of Megiddo was transformed within moments into a green pasture carpeted with luscious soft grass. But this was only the beginning. Eretel felt the tank rock as a sapling sprang out of the ground near it, and a giant cedar tree grew to full size within moments, tipping the vehicle slightly. The dead bodies around the tank appeared to sink into the soft earth, and soon disappeared completely from sight. Butterflies seemed to materialize in droves as new leaves unfolded, and seemingly from nowhere a young deer appeared and nuzzled one of the saints, causing her to laugh wonderingly. There were mutters of awe and wonder from the battle-weary combatants as they witnessed the recreation of planet Earth at its source. Far up above, outside the Earth's atmosphere, the many spacecraft of the Lord's Royal Navy orbited the planet, where they had formed a defensive perimeter. Now, Malachim watched in wonder from these ships as the shrinking ocean's floors were raised and their waters were sucked into the Earth's crust. The Earth's deserts disappeared, ice caps vanished, and mountain ranges were levelled before their eyes. Farther away, in a higher orbit than the ships, lay the holy city, New Jerusalem, that had appeared as prophesied at the end of the tribulation. It was a stunningly beautiful 1,400-mile-long golden cube, comprising 700 levels, each offering nearly 2 million square miles of land for the saints to occupy once their work on earth was finished. It was also dubbed Heaven, as at the centre of it lay the holy temple of Yahweh himself, and any place he dwelt, heaven was also. His light emanated from the temple. It gave the immense structure an abundance of energy and life, and the innate ability to be as close to the earth as it was, without exerting any gravitational pull. The caretakers of the enormous holy city watched breathlessly as a wave of green swept over the globe, transforming the previously ruined orb into a verdant paradise. When it was complete, the entire planet was a giant garden, crisscrossed with mighty rivers and dotted with small seas and great lakes. There was now no place on earth that could not be comfortably inhabited by man. Having finished his work of recreation, Christ sank back into his habitual size and turned to Michael. And now the next phase begins. The archangel nodded, his mechanical suit folding in on itself and retracting into smaller and smaller pieces, until eventually the Malach general stood in his regular tunic and plate armour. Eretel heard a low baritone voice begin to sing a familiar tune, and when he looked over, he realised that it was coming from Uriel. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made. Before long, others joined the chorus, and soon the Garden of Megiddo, soon to be renamed Eden, rang with the voices of the saints, and Malachim joined in praise of their God. When the hymn finished, smaller groups broke into other songs of praise, and Eretel turned to Uriel. So that's it then? It's over for 1,000 years? Uriel laughed heartily, but then his voice took on a serious tone. No, my brother. For us, this is simply a pause for breath. Now we take the fight to the stars.